Just how deep will the Robo signer foreclosure fraud controversy go? That's the question on everybody's mind. They've been asking it for weeks now. And the answer to that question is, how deep do we want it to go? How many rabbit holes are we prepared to go down? How hard are we prepared to seek answers to the questions that are out there, very real questions? It's important to keep in mind that myself and other defense activists have been screaming about these problems for months and some even years now. April Charney, of course, has been screaming about it for years and has been a national leader in the forefront of this long before anybody was talking about it. Greg Clark and other attorneys from this area here in the Tampa-St. Petersburg area have been warning about the catastrophe that was coming because of all of the title problems. And again, that's the fundamental thing to understand about all this. You can grant all the summary judgments you want to. Judges can overlook questions of fact and questions of law. But at the end of the day, what we've done here is created a toxic stew of titles that are going to affect real property for many, many years to come. The disturbing thing about all of this is that it was done in full view of regulators and judges and other people that should have known better. And the thing that's most frustrating to me is the fact that this didn't come to a head because judges finally put their foot down and regulators stepped in or investigators closed down when they knew that all of this was going on. No. It took in the industry itself to realize what a problem they had created for themselves, and frankly, I think a subset of the industry, the title industry, to step in and say, this is such a catastrophe that it cannot continue. It is a dramatic failure in leadership at the state level, at the judicial level, and frankly at the national level. And the real issues are that this was known by all of the parties involved as it went along. And you know, it's sort of a Jon Stewart-like question. Why did they think they would get away with it? How did they think it would continue for so long? So what are we going to do going forward? Well, this has to stop immediately. We cannot continue to grant foreclosures under such questionable circumstances. It's frankly reckless and irresponsible. It does injustice to those that are involved in the foreclosure process in communities all across America. And frankly, it does injustice to the sensibilities of consumers all across this country. You know, the thing that we've got to keep in mind is that there's a growing discontent among all consumers out there, not just those that are involved in foreclosure, but consumers in general, because they understand they're not getting a fair shake by anybody. Now, I understand neighbors and communities that don't like their neighbors living in houses and not making a mortgage payment. But my experience is that the vast majority of people want to make a mortgage payment, but they cannot in circumstances when they're in foreclosure. Some folks might not understand this, but those that have tried to run the mortgage foreclosure modification gauntlet know exactly what I'm talking about. Our federal government set aside $50 billion to try and modify mortgages. And if you talk to anybody that has tried to go through the modification scam with their servicers, they'll tell you it's a disastrous process. I tell my clients to make 6 copies of all the forms that are required by their lender, and so that when the lender inevitably loses the first 3 or 4, they've got a couple more copies of the very same information to send back. The question is, we've known what a failure this modification scam has been for so long. I mean, it didn't take but a couple months before people started mailing in their documentation to try and get these modifications when they realized that this was a real problem. And yet the money kept flowing to the servicers and probably hasn't stopped yet. Let's keep in mind one thing. The very people, the very industries that caused this problem in the first place through the mortgage underwriting and originating process then transferred these bad mortgages up to Wall Street when they securitized them. But the problem is they never really transferred the mortgages or the securities underneath that. They chopped and diced up the mortgages and securities and sold them all around the earth, but they didn't put together the paperwork necessary to memorialize that. And that really is the heart of the problem we face now. Because they didn't do their job correctly way back when these mortgages were originated in 05 and 06, now this disastrous situation is playing out in our courtrooms. But let's keep in mind one thing. Everyone knew they didn't do their job correctly in 05 and 06. When the subprime lenders were going out of business in 05 and 06 and going into bankruptcy and being seized by federal regulators, we all knew that they hadn't put the documents together correctly then. And the question, the very practical question that we have to ask ourselves now is If we knew in '05, '06, '07 that none of this documentation was being done correctly, none of these mortgages were being securitized or recorded or transferred properly, how did we, when I say we, being the leadership in this country, allow these industries to continue? You know, at some point in time, we were known as one of the smartest countries on earth and one of the most entrepreneurial countries on earth. The question that I have is, knowing how bad this problem was back then, '05, '06, '07, why did not the industry step in? Why did not our leadership step in at that point in time and begin correcting the problems, begin preparing the documents correctly so that if they had to foreclose in 2010, 2009, the paperwork trail would already be created. The accounting systems would be created. We wouldn't have the Jeffrey Stefan Robo signing controversies because we would have the infrastructure in place. So what's the solution to all of this? Well, the solution to all of this is hard work, honesty, and integrity. Unfortunately, I think our state court systems have proven unwilling to address the very real problems that exist. Now it requires the federal government, as much as I hate to say that, but someone with some sort of overarching leadership must step in, take control of this entire process. We can no longer allow these servicers who caused the problem and are perpetuating the problem now to continue making the problem worse. We're muddling along in a mud pit, and the people that caused the problem are still in control. So what we need is federal intervention here. I don't know whether it's from the U.S. Attorney's offices or from somewhere out of Congress, but the bottom line is we need federal intervention now to begin analyzing all of these mortgages. There exists in Florida statute a very reasonable provision, Florida statute 69.021, which could be used in this crisis situation to help stem the tide. That's a very interesting statute. It's fascinating that it's been around since the 1930s, the first time we went through a Great Depression, and it's very apropos today. It basically says that when you have bondholders or investors in a mortgage and you can't figure out, or the court doesn't have confidence in knowing who owns the mortgages, an independent committee is appointed, and a homeowner makes their payments to the court. The court then collects those payments and allows someone to step forward at some point in time later and claim that mortgage payment. It removes this entire question about who truly has ownership in these mortgages and who has a right to collect them. So we're going to focus on that going forward. Number one, federal intervention here to get a handle on the whole problem. And number two, looking at Florida statute 69.021 as a way to ensure some stability and some honesty and integrity back into the system. Now, one of the things that's most disturbing, I'll say the thing that is the most disturbing to me, is the fact that while attorneys general in states all across this country have spoken out very publicly and taken very affirmative roles in recognizing the breadth and magnitude of this crisis, and state legislators across the country and in Congress, Florida has been entirely silent on this. There has not been a single state leader that has stepped up in the midst of this crisis and spoken to the people of Florida. I find it totally irresponsible that the Florida Supreme Court has taken such a backwards position on this, essentially throwing their hands up in the air and saying we've got no jurisdiction to investigate or do anything here. Likewise, the Circuit Court down in Palm Beach County attempting to limit the investigation of foreclosure mills. That to me seems to be a complete abdication of responsibility of our court system in trying to deal with this problem. There's another interesting question, and that is, are these rocket dockets that have been implemented across the state of Florida constitutional? And part of that, it's a technical legal question, but the issue is when you have senior judges who are not elected and therefore really have responsibility to no one, is it appropriate from a constitutional perspective for these senior judges to be making final and dispositive rulings on issues of great importance to Floridians? Earlier I posted a transcript of a hearing and a very good motion that was drafted by a colleague of mine from the panhandle of the state. It raises a very important technical question about whether these foreclosure rocket docket courtrooms are even constitutional. in my mind, if we are going to use senior judges, and I think there absolutely is a place for that, but if we're going to use senior judges, they should be used to hear non-dispositive matters, the other motions that are heard before summary judgment. You see, if we're going to be throwing our neighbors out in the street, I think that job has to be done by elected circuit court judges, not by senior court judges. I think that there is an important constitutional imperative here which says that if we're doing things that are so significant, potentially controversial, I think the Constitution would mandate that there be some pushback, some ability for consumers or the voters who are affected by this to respond to the judges that are acting improperly. I'm concerned that the senior judge system is just a way for our elected judges to dodge the responsibility for what they're involved in by just pushing this off to senior judges that have absolutely no responsibility at all to the electorate. That gets into the suffrage argument, and again, there's some more technical elements there, but the fundamentals here that we all have to understand is that we've got a real problem in our foreclosure courts, and the people are aware of this now. The press is aware of this. It's time for us all to stand up and be fighting against this. I know a lot of you have been going it alone, but now's the time to find a good foreclosure defense attorney in your area and start fighting, because if you don't get in the middle of this right now, keep in mind they're still granting foreclosure judgments despite what you hear about moratoriums and stopping these cases. So if you don't have adequate representation now, you may miss out on the opportunity to protect your family going forward in the future. Keep up the good fight, and please keep your stories coming to me.